When you think of figures who truly changed the world, for better or for worse, Vladimir Lenin has to be right at the top of that list. We're talking about a man whose ideas didn't just change a country, they basically split the 20th century in two and completely redrew the map. So today, we're going to try to understand the life and, yeah, the very contested legacy of Lenin. I mean, just look at this. For a whole century, his body has been right there on public display in Moscow's Red Square. It's this kind of strange, permanent symbol of his impact. And you have to wonder, right? Who was the man in the mausoleum? How did one person come to inspire so much devotion and, at the exact same time, so much hatred all over the world? Okay, so at the most basic level, who was he? Lenin was a Russian revolutionary. Simple as that. But he was the guy, the mastermind behind the October Revolution in 1917. This was the event that toppled the government and created the world's very first communist state, the Soviet Union. And guess who was its first leader? Yep, him. And this is where the whole story gets messy. Because there really are two completely different Lenins, depending on who you ask. On one side, you've got millions who saw him as a hero, a liberator who fought for the working class and stood up to empires. But then, for millions of others, he was the guy who built a brutal dictatorship, a man who unleashed state terror on his own people. So, how can both of those things be true about the same person? So, let's back up. How did he even become this huge historical figure? Well, he wasn't born a revolutionary, not at all. The guy who was born Vladimir Ulyanov was really forged into one, pushed onto this radical path by a whole lot of personal tragedy and some incredibly powerful ideas that were sweeping across Europe at the time. And you can really see the exact moment his life took a hard turn. I mean, look at this timeline. In just about 1 year, his entire world fell apart. First, his dad dies suddenly. Then, and this is huge, his older brother, Alexander, is executed for being part of a plot to kill the Tsar. Right after that, Lenin himself gets kicked out of university for protesting. Suddenly, the fight against the system wasn't some abstract political idea anymore. For him, it was now deeply, deeply personal. And he found a place to channel all that anger in the writings of Karl Marx. Marxism gave him a theory, a kind of rule book for revolution. The idea was that all of history is just a story of class struggle, and that, eventually, the working class, what Marx called the proletariat, was destined to rise up, smash capitalism, and build a brand new socialist world. For Lenin, this wasn't just an idea. It became his life's mission. All right, let's jump forward to 1917. After spending years in exile, Lenin sees his moment. Russia is an absolute mess. The Tsar has just been overthrown, and the country is getting torn to shreds by World War I. Now, for Lenin, this wasn't just chaos. It was the perfect storm. This was his chance to put all that Marxist theory into practice. And here's where we get one of the great ironies of history. Who helps him get back to Russia? Germany. Russia's enemy in the war. They literally put him on this thing called a sealed train and shipped him across their territory. Their gamble was that he'd stir up enough trouble to knock Russia out of the war. Man, they had absolutely no idea what they were about to unleash on the world. The second he gets back, Lenin just blows everyone's minds, even a lot of his own supporters, the Bolsheviks. He drops what's called his April Theses, and it's basically this radical blueprint for a takeover. He's demanding an immediate end to the war, says there should be zero support for the new government, and famously declares all power to the Soviets, these workers' councils. The key thing here is, he wasn't talking about reform. He was calling for a second, much more radical, total revolution. And then in October, he makes his move. And, it wasn't some huge popular uprising like you might imagine. It was a really fast, surgically precise coup. His Red Guards took control of all the key spots, bridges, train stations, the telephone exchange. Then the cruiser Aurora fires a blank shot. That was the signal. They storm the Winter Palace, arrest the government ministers, and just like that, it's over. Lenin walks into the Congress of Soviets and just announces, "We're in charge now." But, grabbing power is one thing. Actually holding on to it, that's a whole different ballgame. And the high-minded ideals of the revolution pretty quickly slammed into the brutal reality of what was coming. Civil war, famine, and just the massive, insane challenge of building a new country from the rubble of the old one. And this right here, this really gets to the core contradiction of Lenin's time in power. The promise was so simple and powerful: peace, land, and bread. But the price they paid to keep that promise and to stay in charge was incredibly steep. Peace meant signing a humiliating treaty with Germany and giving up huge chunks of territory. And getting land and bread to some people meant taking grain by force from others, the peasants. And any opposition, it was crushed by a state-sponsored campaign of violence they literally called the Red Terror. And what's wild is that Lenin was totally, 100% unapologetic about all this. He didn't see violence as some unfortunate side effect. He saw it as a tool, the primary tool of the state. As he saw it, the old state used violence to protect the rich. His state, well, it would use violence in the interests of the people. And of course, he would be the one to decide what those interests were. The result of these policies was just catastrophic. A horrifying famine ripped across the country in 1921. Now, it was triggered by a drought, sure, but it was made so much worse by the government's policy of seizing grain. It left peasants with literally nothing to eat and no incentive to even plant crops for the next year. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 5 million people starved to death. Facing total economic collapse and riots breaking out everywhere, Lenin had to face facts. The policy was an absolute disaster. The crisis basically forced him into what you could only call a stunning strategic retreat. He introduced something called the New Economic Policy, the NEP, which, get this, brought back small-scale private farming and businesses. Just think about that for a second. The world's leading communist had to use a dose of capitalism to save his communist state from completely falling apart. But Lenin wouldn't be around to see how all these policies played out in the long run. A series of strokes left him more and more helpless, and he had to watch from the sidelines as a nasty power struggle started to brew all around him. And at the same time, the seeds of a myth were being planted, a myth that would grow to be much bigger than the man himself. While he was sick, he dictated what we now call his testament, which was basically his final thoughts on who should succeed him. And what's absolutely fascinating is this chilling warning he gives about Joseph Stalin, who was the party's general secretary at the time. Lenin wrote that Stalin was too crude and had way too much power concentrated in his hands. He pretty much begged his comrades to find a way to remove him. That warning was completely ignored. So after Lenin died in 1924, Stalin and the state got to work building this massive personality cult around him. They created this image of Lenin as a hero, an almost godlike figure, the infallible genius of the revolution. You can see it on the coin here. But that myth was a world away from the reality of his last few years. A weak, silenced man, stuck in his mansion, watching his revolution head in a direction that he himself was starting to fear. So here we are, 100 years later, and we're right back where we started. That central question still hangs over everything. Was Lenin a liberator who, whatever the costs, was genuinely fighting for a better, more equal world? Or was he the architect of a totalitarian nightmare, a system whose brutality paved the way for the even worse horrors under Stalin? I think his legacy is this really stark reminder that the road to utopia is often paved with absolute brutality, and that the people who promise to remake the world rarely leave it a simpler place.